There's nothing quite like the sting of being laughed at by people you've known your whole life. For 67 years, Amos Zook had watched his neighbors shake their heads at the old barn his great-grandfather left him. The whole town called it an eyesore. When he spent his last $3,000 fixing the leaky roof, they said he was throwing good money after bad. Total waste, they whispered at the general store. But Amos knew something they didn't. Sometimes what looks worthless to others holds the greatest treasure. When lightning cracked open one of those old beams, he found a hidden wall his ancestor had sealed 80 years ago. Behind it sat something that would change everything. The same people who mocked him would soon be knocking on his door with apologies and checkbooks. What was hidden in that barn that made it worth $111 million? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over the rolling fields of Lancaster County as Amos Zook stepped onto his front porch, coffee cup in hand. At 67, his movements carried the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that rushing rarely improved anything worth doing. The wooden boards beneath his feet creaked with familiar comfort, sounds he'd been hearing since childhood in this same farmhouse where 4 generations of Zooks had lived, worked and raised their families. Behind him, through the screen door, he could hear his sister Sarah humming as she prepared breakfast. At 62, she had never married, choosing instead to care for their aging parents until their deaths, and then staying on to help Amos manage the household. Her presence had been a blessing, especially after his wife Martha passed away 12 years ago. The farm felt too big and too quiet, without the sound of children's laughter echoing through the rooms. Amos gazed across the 140 acres that had been in his family since 1892, when his great-great-grandfather first purchased the land from an English family heading west. The fields stretched toward the horizon in neat rows, corn to the north, soybeans to the south, and a small pasture where their 3 horses grazed peacefully in the morning light. Everything about this view spoke of continuity, of seasons turning in their proper order, of the patient work that sustained both body and soul. But his eyes inevitably settled on the source of his daily heartache, the massive barn that dominated the western edge of his property. Even in the soft morning light, its deteriorating condition was impossible to ignore. The red paint had faded to a rusty brown, and several sheets of metal siding hung loose, rattling whenever the wind picked up. The roof, despite his recent expensive repairs, still bore the scars of decades of harsh Pennsylvania winters. This barn had been built by his great-grandfather, Ezra Zook, sometime in the late 1930s. Unlike the traditional Amish barns, with their classic gambrel roofs and weathered wood siding, this structure was different, larger, more industrial in design, with a peculiar layout that had always puzzled the family. Ezra had been secretive about its construction, hiring English contractors instead of relying on the community barn-raising tradition that bound Amish families together. The other families in their district had never quite understood Ezra's choices. He had been quieter than most, more withdrawn, and there had always been whispered questions about the years he'd spent away from the community in his youth. Some said he'd worked in the cities during the Depression. Others claimed he'd traveled as far as Ohio looking for work. But Ezra never spoke of those years, and by the time Amos was old enough to ask questions, his great-grandfather's memory had begun to fade. Now, nearly 30 years after Ezra's death, the barn stood as a monument to those mysteries. Every spring, Amos received visits from neighbors suggesting it was time to tear it down. An eyesore, they called it, a waste of good farmland. The complaints had intensified over the past 5 years as the structure's condition worsened. Just last month, Bishop Miller had stopped by after the Sunday service. A kind man in his 70s, the bishop had served their district for over 20 years and was respected for his gentle wisdom. But even he had seemed uncomfortable as he approached the subject of the barn. Amos, he had said, stroking his long gray beard as they stood in the yard, I've been receiving concerns from several families about the barn. They worry it might collapse in a storm and cause damage to neighboring properties. Amos had nodded respectfully. I understand their concerns, Bishop, but it belonged to my great-grandfather. It feels wrong to tear down something he built with his own hands. I appreciate your loyalty to family, son. But sometimes we must choose between honoring the past and being responsible to our community. The barn serves no purpose now except to remind us of its decay. That conversation had weighed heavily on Amos's mind. He knew the bishop was right from a practical standpoint. The barn was too damaged to house animals or store crops. It had stood empty for over a decade, serving no function except to drain his modest savings every time a storm caused new damage. Yet something deep in his heart resisted the logical arguments. Perhaps it was stubbornness, a trait the Zook family was known for. Or maybe it was the fading memory of afternoons spent in that barn as a child, listening to his great-grandfather's stories while they repaired harnesses or sorted seed corn. Ezra had been a man of few words, but in those quiet moments, he had shared fragments of wisdom that still guided Amos's decisions today. Boy, Ezra used to say, running his weathered hands along the barn's solid oak beams. Sometimes the things that look broken on the outside are the strongest things you'll ever find. Don't judge by appearances. Judge by what's built to last. Those words had taken on new meaning 3 months ago, when a severe thunderstorm had damaged a section of the roof. Instead of viewing it as another sign that the barn should come down, Amos had seen it as a call to action. Against all practical advice, and using the last of his savings, he had hired a roofing contractor to repair the damage. The decision had caused quite a stir in the community. At Yoda's General Store, the unofficial headquarters for local gossip, the topic had dominated conversations for weeks. $3,000 for a new roof on that old wreck. Martha Stoltzfus had declared loudly enough for half the store to hear. Amos has lost his mind. My husband says it's like putting a new hat on a scarecrow, added Rebecca Fisher. Pretty on top, but still falling apart underneath. Even some of his closest friends had questioned the decision. Daniel Byler, who farmed the adjacent property, had shaken his head sadly when he heard the news. Amos, that money could have bought you a good used tractor, or fixed up your farmhouse kitchen for Sarah. Why throw it away on something that should have been torn down years ago? The criticism stung, but Amos couldn't explain the feeling that had driven his decision. It wasn't rational or practical, qualities highly valued in their community. It was something deeper, a sense that he owed his great-grandfather's memory more than simple abandonment. Sarah had been his only supporter, though even she had expressed reservations privately. I understand why you want to preserve it, she had said one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. But people are starting to talk. They think you're being foolish with money we can't afford to waste. Let them talk, Amos had replied, though her words troubled him more than he cared to admit. I've lived my whole life trying to be practical and responsible. Maybe it's time I honored something that can't be measured in dollars and cents. Now, 3 months later, he could see that his neighbor's predictions had been partially correct. Despite the new roof, other parts of the barn continued to deteriorate. Just last week, he had noticed that one of the main support posts was developing a concerning lean. Soon, he might face another expensive repair decision. The sound of Sarah calling him for breakfast interrupted his morning contemplation. As he turned to go inside, a movement caught his eye near the barn's entrance. A red-tailed hawk had perched on one of the fence posts, surveying the fields with the patient intensity of a predator. For a moment, man and bird regarded each other across the dewy grass. The hawk's presence struck Amos as somehow significant, though he couldn't say why. In Amish tradition, they didn't put much stock in omens or signs, believing instead that God's will revealed itself through prayer and community discernment. But there was something about the hawk's fierce dignity, its refusal to abandon its chosen perch despite the barn's deteriorating condition, that resonated with his own stubborn loyalty. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen was warm, with the smells of bacon, eggs, and fresh biscuits. Sarah had set the table with their mother's best china, a small luxury she insisted on for their daily meals. "You were out there a long time," she observed, pouring coffee into his cup. "Still worrying about the barn?" "Always worrying about the barn," he admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if everyone's right. Maybe I am throwing good money after bad?" Sarah sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. At 62, she possessed the kind of serene wisdom that came from a lifetime of quiet observation. Her greying hair was pulled back in the simple style of their faith, and her dress was the plain blue that marked her as an unmarried woman in their community. "Do you remember," she said slowly, "when Grossdaddy Ezra used to take us out there on summer evenings?" Amos nodded. "He'd tell us stories about the old country, about his father's farm in Ohio before they moved here. I always wondered why he built such a different kind of barn. Most of the men our age can tell you every detail about how their grandfathers' barns were raised, which neighbors helped, what kind of wood they used, how many days it took. But Ezra never talked about building that barn. It was true. The barn-raising tradition was sacred in their community, a symbol of mutual dependence and shared labor. Yet none of the older families could remember participating in the construction of Ezra's barn. It had simply appeared one year, built by outsiders and standing apart from the architectural traditions that connected their farms to their shared heritage. "I found something last week," Sarah said quietly, reaching into her apron pocket. "I was cleaning out the old secretary desk in the front room, and this was stuck behind one of the drawers." She handed him a small, weathered leather journal, no bigger than his palm. The cover was worn smooth by handling, and the corners were bent with age. On the front, in faded gold lettering, were the initials E.Z., Ezra Zook. Amos opened the journal carefully, mindful of the brittle pages. The entries were written in his great-grandfather's careful German script, the language of their ancestors that fewer and fewer families still used for daily conversation. His own German was rusty, but he could make out dates from the 1930s and 1940s, along with what appeared to be financial records and brief personal notes. One entry caught his attention. Dated September 1938. Contract signed today. "The burden is heavy, but the family's future must be secured. May God forgive what I must keep hidden. Can you read it?" Sarah asked, watching his expression. "Some of it." "But Sarah, this suggests that Grossdaddy was involved in something he felt guilty about. Something he kept secret from the family. Maybe that's why the barn is so important to you," she said gently. "Maybe there are answers waiting there." Before Amos could respond, the sound of buggy wheels on gravel announced a visitor. Through the window, they could see Daniel Byler climbing down from his rig, his expression serious enough to suggest this wasn't a social call. Amos stepped onto the porch to greet his neighbor, the journal still in his hand. "Morning, Daniel. You're out early today." Daniel removed his hat and nodded respectfully. "Amos, I need to speak with you about something important. It's about the barn." The two men had been friends since childhood, and Amos could read concern in Daniel's weathered face. "What's troubling you?" "I got a call yesterday from someone at the county planning office. They've had complaints about your barn, people saying it's unsafe, that it might collapse and cause property damage. They're talking about sending an inspector." Amos felt his stomach tighten. A county inspection could result in a condemnation order, forcing him to tear down the barn whether he wanted to or not. "Who made the complaints?" "They wouldn't say. But Amos, maybe this is God's way of telling you it's time to let go. You've spent your savings trying to save something that might be beyond saving." As his friend spoke, Amos's grip tightened on his great-grandfather's journal. The pages seemed to warm under his touch, as if the old leather held secrets that demanded to be uncovered. For the first time since making the decision to repair the roof, he felt a surge of certainty that went beyond stubborn loyalty or sentimental attachment. "Daniel, I appreciate your concern, I truly do. But I'm not ready to give up on that barn just yet." His neighbor shook his head sadly. "I hope you know what you're doing, Amos. Some fights aren't worth fighting." As Daniel's buggy disappeared down the lane, Amos looked back at the barn with new eyes. The morning hawk had vanished, but its message seemed clear. Sometimes the things worth preserving required more than practical wisdom. They required the kind of faith that looked beyond present appearances to hidden possibilities. That evening, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Amos sat on his porch, reading his great-grandfather's journal by lamplight, unaware that the approaching lightning would soon reveal secrets that had been waiting 80 years to change his life forever. The storm arrived with the fury of an Old Testament judgment, turning the peaceful Pennsylvania countryside into a battlefield of wind and lightning. Amos had seen plenty of severe weather in his 67 years, but this tempest seemed to carry a personal vengeance against his property. From the safety of his kitchen window, he watched as sheets of rain hammered the barn's new roof, the roof that had cost him his last $3,000 and earned him nothing but ridicule from his neighbors. Each flash of lightning illuminated the structure like a photograph, freezing it in stark black and white against the turbulent sky. "It's holding," Sarah observed, standing beside him with a cup of tea, warming her hands. "Your new roof is doing its job." Amos nodded, feeling a small measure of vindication. Perhaps his investment hadn't been as foolish as everyone claimed. The barn had weathered storms for over 80 years. Surely it could survive another night. Then, as if the heavens had heard his thoughts and decided to test them, a bolt of lightning split the darkness with such intensity that the kitchen windows rattled in their frames. The thunder that followed wasn't the distant rumble they'd been hearing all evening. It was the sharp crack of electricity, finding its target close at hand. "Dear Lord," Sarah whispered, pressing her hand to her chest. "That was close, too close." Amos grabbed his rain slicker from the hook by the door and headed for the porch, despite Sarah's protests that he wait for the storm to pass. Something deep in his bones told him that lightning strike had found his barn, and he needed to see the damage with his own eyes. The rain struck him like cold needles as he stepped into the yard. The wind was strong enough to make walking treacherous, but he pushed forward, using his flashlight to cut through the darkness. With each step toward the barn, his apprehension grew. The air still crackled with electrical energy, and the smell of ozone hung heavy despite the driving rain. When he reached the barn's entrance, his flashlight beam revealed what he had feared. The lightning had struck one of the main support beams, a massive oak timber that had anchored the barn's western wall for 8 decades. The beam was split nearly in half, with one section twisted at an unnatural angle. But as Amos moved his light along the damaged timber, something caught his attention that made him forget about the storm raging around him. Where the lightning had split the beam, he could see that it wasn't solid wood all the way through. There appeared to be a hollow space, carefully carved out and concealed so skillfully that it had remained hidden for generations. Heart racing, he stepped closer for a better look. The cavity in the beam was man-made, precisely cut with the skill of a master craftsman. And it wasn't empty. Something had been placed inside, something wrapped in what looked like oilcloth and secured with twine that had somehow survived decades of temperature changes and humidity. Amos looked around the barn with new eyes, his flashlight beam dancing across the other support timbers. If one beam had been hollow, were there others? His great-grandfather had been known for his meticulous woodworking, but this level of concealment suggested something far more significant than hiding Christmas presents or saving money in a coffee can. The storm was beginning to move east, the thunder growing more distant and the rain settling into a steady drumming on the metal roof. Amos knew he should return to the house, wait for morning to properly examine what he'd found. But the moment felt too significant for delay. After 80 years of keeping its secrets, the barn had finally revealed that it held more than anyone had imagined. With trembling hands, he reached into the hollow beam and carefully extracted the wrapped package. It was heavier than expected, and through the oilcloth he could feel what seemed to be papers or documents. The twine came away easily, too easily for something that had been hidden for decades, suggesting that his great-grandfather had intended for this cache to be discovered eventually. Inside the oilcloth wrapping, Amos found a collection of documents that made his breath catch in his throat. Even in the dim light of his flashlight, he could see official-looking papers with government seals, photographs of men in military uniforms, and what appeared to be contracts or agreements filled with legal language he didn't understand. One photograph in particular drew his attention. A group of soldiers standing in front of a large tent, their faces serious and determined. In the center of the group stood a younger version of his great-grandfather, Ezra, wearing a uniform that Amos didn't recognize. The man he'd known as a quiet farmer who rarely spoke of the outside world had apparently lived a very different life before settling into the peaceful rhythms of their Amish community, but it was the contract that truly shook him. Though the legal terminology was complex, certain phrases stood out clearly: storage facility, classified materials, compensation for services rendered, and most shocking of all, mineral rights assessment included in scope of agreement. The document was dated 1941 and bore the signatures of his great-grandfather and several government officials. Amos sank onto an old wooden crate, trying to process what he was seeing. His great-grandfather, the man who had raised him to value simplicity and separation from worldly affairs, had apparently been involved with the U.S. government during World War II. Not only involved, but trusted with something important enough to require this level of secrecy and concealment. The implications were staggering. If Ezra had been storing materials for the government, what had happened to those materials? Were they still here, hidden somewhere else in the barn? And what did the contract mean by mineral rights assessment? Thunder rumbled in the distance as Amos carefully rewrapped the documents and secured them inside his slicker. The storm was moving on, but he felt as though his world had been struck by lightning, just as surely as the barn beam. Everything he thought he knew about his family's history had just been called into question. Back in the house, Zara took one look at his expression and poured him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one. "The barn?" she asked simply. "Damaged but still standing." He pulled out the wrapped documents and placed them on the kitchen table. "But I found something, Sarah. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about Grossdaddy Ezra." As he unwrapped the papers and began to explain what he'd discovered, Sarah's expression shifted from concern to amazement to something approaching fear. "He was in the military," she whispered, staring at the photograph of their great-grandfather in uniform. "But that's impossible. Our family has always been pacifist. We don't serve in wars." Apparently Ezra made an exception. Amos pointed to the contract. "And look at this. He wasn't just serving, he was providing services. Storage services. Right here on our farm." Sarah leaned closer to examine the documents, her finger tracing the official seals and signatures. "What kind of materials do you think he was storing?" "I don't know. But Sarah, look at this clause about mineral rights. What if the government wasn't just using our land for storage? What if they were studying it, testing it for something?" The two siblings sat in the warm kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comforts of their simple life, while the documents on the table suggested their property held secrets that could change everything. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind the clean smell of rain and the promise of a new day that would bring questions neither of them was prepared to answer. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked finally. Amos looked toward the window, where the barn stood silhouetted against the clearing sky. The lightning that had damaged it had also revealed its secrets, as if his great-grandfather had planned for this moment. "Perhaps the time for keeping secrets had finally passed. I'm going to find out what else is hidden in that barn," he said quietly. "And I'm going to learn what Grossdaddy Ezra was really doing all those years ago." As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, Amos felt the weight of family history settling on his shoulders. The barn that his neighbors called worthless might hold answers to questions he hadn't even known to ask. The man who had taught him to value simplicity had apparently lived a life of complexity that challenged everything the Amish community believed about separation from the world's affairs. Tomorrow, he would begin the search for truth, whatever the cost to his quiet life might be. Dawn came slowly the morning after the storm. the sun struggling to break through lingering clouds that hung over Lancaster County like smoke from a dying fire. Amos had slept little, his mind churning with questions about the documents he'd discovered. By 5 o'clock, he was already dressed and heading back to the barn, a thermos of coffee and his great-grandfather's leather journal tucked under his arm. The damage from the lightning strike looked even more dramatic in daylight. The massive oak beam that had anchored the western wall for 8 decades was split cleanly down the middle, its hidden cavity now exposed like a mouth opened in surprise. But what captured Amos's attention was what lay scattered on the barn floor beneath the damaged timber, fragments of wood and debris that revealed additional hollow spaces in the surrounding structure. His great-grandfather hadn't just carved out one hiding place. The entire support system of the barn had been honeycombed with secret compartments, each one carefully concealed and ingeniously integrated into the building's framework. What had appeared to be solid construction was actually an elaborate system of hidden storage, designed by someone who understood both carpentry and the art of concealment. Working methodically, Amos began to explore each cavity that the storm had revealed. The first yielded another cache of documents wrapped in oilcloth, these bearing the seal of the War Department and dated throughout 1942. The papers were filled with technical language that was largely beyond his understanding, but certain phrases jumped out at him. Strategic materials, emergency reserves, classified storage protocols. Most intriguing was a detailed inventory list that included items like petroleum-based compounds, 40 drums, industrial solvents, 25 containers, and geological survey equipment, miscellaneous. The list was signed by his great-grandfather and countersigned by a government official whose title was listed simply as Regional Coordinator, Emergency Storage Program. As Amos spread the documents on an old workbench, he tried to reconcile what he was reading with everything he'd known about Ezra Zook. The man had been quiet, devout and seemingly uninterested in anything beyond the boundaries of his farm. Yet these papers painted a picture of someone deeply involved in a government program that appeared to span multiple years of the war. The sealed military contract he'd found the night before was even more revealing in daylight. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the basic agreement was clear. In exchange for the use of his property as a storage facility, Ezra would receive regular payments and, most significantly, a comprehensive geological survey of his land to assess potential strategic value of subsurface resources. That phrase made Amos's pulse quicken. Strategic value of subsurface resources. What had the government been looking for beneath his family's farm? A folder labeled Geological Assessment, Confidential, contained maps and charts that meant little to him, but the summary report was written in plain English that left him stunned. According to the government geologists, the Zook property sat atop significant natural gas deposits that could be economically viable for extraction with proper development. The report was dated December 1943, and attached to it was a handwritten note from Ezra, information received and understood, family's future secured if God wills it. We'll maintain silence as agreed. Amos set down the papers and walked to the barn's open doorway, looking out over the familiar fields where 4 generations of his family had grown corn and soybeans. Beneath those fields, apparently, lay natural gas deposits that the government had known about for over 80 years. The knowledge that his great-grandfather had died with, knowledge that might have changed the family's financial circumstances dramatically. But why had Ezra kept it secret? The Amish weren't opposed to prosperity, as long as it was earned through honest work and didn't compromise their faith. Natural gas reserves would have provided income without requiring major changes to their way of life. The answer came in another document. This one a personal letter from Ezra to someone identified only as Colonel Morrison. The letter was dated 1945, near the end of the war. The materials you entrusted to my care have been safely maintained throughout the duration of the conflict. However, I must respectfully decline your suggestion that we pursue development of the mineral resources identified in your survey. My people have lived simply for generations, and I fear that sudden wealth would bring changes our community is not prepared to handle. The knowledge of what lies beneath our land will remain with me alone, as will the location of the stored materials. Should circumstances change in the future, my descendants will have the information they need to make their own decisions. Amos read the letter 3 times, each reading deepening his respect for his great-grandfather's wisdom and his amazement at the burden the man had carried alone. Ezra had been offered what amounted to a fortune and had turned it down to preserve his family's way of life. He had chosen to protect them from temptation by keeping the secret to himself. But where were the stored materials Ezra had mentioned? The documents suggested that 40 drums of petroleum compounds and 25 containers of industrial solvents had been placed somewhere on the property for safekeeping during the war. If they were still here, they could represent a significant environmental hazard, or, depending on their contents, something even more valuable. As if in answer to his unspoken question, Amos found one final document that made his hands shake as he read it. It was a hand-drawn map of the barn, showing the location of what was labeled as primary storage chamber, below foundation level. According to the drawing, beneath the barn's concrete floor lay a reinforced underground room, accessible through a concealed entrance somewhere near the building's northeast corner. The map was annotated with notes in Ezra's careful handwriting. Sealed August 1945, contents per government inventory. Entrance secured with family marker, Sarah's quilt pattern, northeast beam, 3rd board from ground level, Sarah's quilt pattern. His great-grandfather had used his own mother's needlework design as a secret marker, hidden in plain sight on one of the barn's support posts. It was exactly the kind of clever concealment that Ezra would have devised, meaningful to family members who knew what to look for, but invisible to outsiders. Amos walked quickly to the barn's northeast corner and began examining the weathered boards of the support beam. At first he saw nothing unusual, but when he knelt and looked more closely at the 3rd board from ground level, he could make out faint lines carved into the wood, lines that, when traced with his finger, revealed the pattern of interlocking rings that had been his great-great-grandmother Sarah's signature quilting design. The board was loose, held in place by wooden pegs that had been designed to be removable. When Amos worked them free, the board came away to reveal a metal handle attached to what appeared to be a heavy wooden panel. The panel moved reluctantly, its hinges protesting after decades of disuse. But it opened to reveal a narrow stairway leading down into darkness. The air that rose from the hidden chamber was stale, but not unpleasant, dry and slightly cool, with a faint chemical odor that suggested the presence of the stored materials mentioned in the government documents. Amos peered into the darkness, his heart hammering with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. After 80 years, his great-grandfather's greatest secret was about to be revealed. But as he stood at the threshold of the hidden chamber, Amos wondered if some secrets were meant to stay buried, and whether uncovering them would bring more blessing or curse to his quiet life. Amos knew he was in over his head. Standing at the entrance to his great-grandfather's hidden chamber, flashlight in hand, he realized that whatever lay below might require expertise he didn't possess. The faint chemical smell rising from the darkness suggested materials that could be dangerous if handled improperly. And the government documents he'd found made it clear that environmental safety hadn't been a primary concern in 1943. After spending an hour cataloging the documents he'd discovered, Amos made a decision that went against every instinct for privacy and self-reliance that his upbringing had instilled. He was going to call in outside help. Back in the farmhouse, Sarah listened with growing amazement as he described the underground chamber and the implications of what they'd learned about their great-grandfather, an environmental specialist. She repeated when he explained his plan. Amos, you know what people will think. First, the expensive roof repairs, now bringing in English experts to examine our property. They'll say you've completely lost touch with our ways. Maybe I have, he admitted, pouring himself another cup of coffee. But Sarah, what if those materials down there are dangerous? What if they've been leaking into our well water or the soil where we grow our food? I can't ignore that possibility just to avoid gossip. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying her brother's face. In their 67 and 62 years, respectively, neither of them had ever been the subject of community speculation. They had lived quietly, followed the Ordnung faithfully, and minded their own business. The idea of deliberately inviting outside scrutiny felt like stepping off a cliff. "Who would you call?" she asked finally. Amos had already thought about this. Daniel mentioned that his English neighbor, the professor who bought the old Morrison place, does some kind of environmental work. Maybe he could recommend someone. That afternoon, Amos hitched up his buggy and drove the 3 miles to the Morrison farm, now owned by Dr. James Henderson, a retired chemistry professor from Penn State who had moved to Lancaster County 5 years earlier, seeking a quieter life. Henderson was known in the community as a helpful neighbor who respected Amish customs and never pushed his own modern conveniences on others. Dr. Henderson listened with growing interest as Amos carefully described his discovery, though he omitted the specific details about government involvement and potential mineral resources. Some secrets, he felt, needed to be revealed gradually. Environmental contamination from World War II-era storage. Henderson mused, stroking his grey beard. That's not uncommon, unfortunately. The military stored all kinds of materials during the war without much consideration for long-term environmental impact. You're wise to have it evaluated professionally. Henderson recommended Dr. Rebecca Chen, an environmental consultant based in Philadelphia who specialized in historical contamination issues. She's worked on several sites where the government stored materials during the war, he explained. She understands both the technical and legal complexities involved. That evening, Amos made the phone call from the small phone shanty shared by several families in their district. Dr. Chen listened carefully to his description of the situation, asking detailed questions about the age of the materials, the type of containers involved, and any documentation he might have found. "Mr. Zook, what you're describing could potentially be very significant," she said. "Not just from an environmental standpoint, but historically as well. The emergency storage program was classified for decades, and there are very few sites where the original materials are still intact." She agreed to come out the following week for a preliminary assessment, and Amos felt both relief and apprehension as he hung up the phone. Once Dr. Chen arrived, there would be no keeping his discovery secret. The quiet life he and Sarah had always known was about to change forever. Dr. Rebecca Chen arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in early October, driving a white SUV loaded with equipment that looked sophisticated enough to launch spacecraft. Amos watched from his kitchen window as she parked near the barn and began unloading cases of instruments. Her movements efficient and professional. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with short, black hair and an easy smile that put him at ease despite his nervousness about bringing an outsider into his family's private affairs. She wore practical work clothes and boots that suggested she was accustomed to getting her hands dirty. "Mr. Zook," she said, extending her hand as he approached. "Thank you for calling me. This could be a very important discovery from a historical perspective. I appreciate you coming all this way, Dr. Chen, but I should warn you, some of my neighbors aren't entirely comfortable with outsiders examining our property." She nodded understandingly. "I've worked with several Amish families over the years. I understand the importance of discretion and respect for your community's values." As they walked toward the barn, Amos felt compelled to explain the criticism he'd been facing. "People think I'm foolish for spending money to preserve this old building. They say I should have torn it down years ago." Dr. Chen paused to examine the barn's exterior, running her hand along the weathered siding and studying the construction techniques. "From what I can see, this building is remarkably well constructed. Your great-grandfather was clearly a skilled craftsman. The fact that it survived 80 years with minimal maintenance is testament to the quality of his work. Her words provided more validation than Amos had received from his own community in months. He was a man of many talents, apparently, more than our family ever realized. Inside the barn, Dr. Chen's demeanor became more focused as Amos showed her the documents he'd discovered and explained how the lightning strike had revealed the hidden compartments. She examined each paper carefully, taking digital photographs and making notes on a tablet computer. "Mr. Zook, what you've found here is extraordinary," she said finally. The emergency storage program was one of the most classified operations of World War II. Very few complete document sets have survived, and even fewer storage sites have been located intact. She was particularly interested in the geological survey reports. These mineral assessments were conducted by some of the best geologists of their era. If they identified significant natural gas deposits beneath your property, that information is likely still accurate today. You mean the gas is still there? Natural gas deposits don't disappear. If anything, modern extraction techniques would make these resources much more accessible than they were in the 1940s. She looked at him seriously. "Mr. Zook, depending on the extent of these deposits, your property could be worth considerably more than you might imagine." The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. "How much more?" "I can't give you specific numbers without proper geological surveys, but properties with confirmed natural gas reserves in this region have sold for tens of millions of dollars. Sometimes more." Amos sat down heavily on an old wooden crate, trying to process what she was telling him. The barn that his neighbors called worthless might be sitting on top of a fortune that dwarfed anything his family had ever imagined possible. "But first," Dr. Chen continued, "we need to assess what's in that underground chamber. Some of the materials stored during the war were quite hazardous, and they may have deteriorated over time." Together, they descended the narrow stairway into Ezra's hidden chamber. Dr. Chen's powerful LED flashlight revealed a room about 12 feet square, with concrete walls and a surprisingly dry atmosphere. Along the walls stood rows of metal drums and containers, each one labeled with codes and dates that corresponded to the inventory lists they'd found above. "Remarkable," Dr. Chen breathed, moving her light across the stored materials. "These containers appear to be in excellent condition. Your great-grandfather chose his storage location well. The constant temperature and low humidity down here have preserved everything." She used a handheld device to test the air quality, checking for dangerous vapors or radiation. "The atmosphere is safe," she reported. "Whatever's in these containers, it's not leaking." As they examined the storage chamber more thoroughly, Dr. Chen explained the significance of what they were seeing. During World War II, the government established emergency storage sites throughout the country to protect strategic materials from potential enemy attacks. Most of these sites were decommissioned after the war, but apparently this one was simply sealed and forgotten. What kind of strategic materials? Everything from petroleum products to rare metals to industrial chemicals needed for weapons production. Some of these substances would be extremely valuable today, not just for their intrinsic worth, but as historical artifacts. When they emerged from the chamber, Dr. Chen was already making plans for a comprehensive assessment. "I'll need to bring in additional specialists, a geologist for the mineral survey, a hazardous materials expert for the stored containers, and probably a historian to properly document everything." Amos felt simultaneously excited and overwhelmed. "How long will all this take?" "Several weeks, possibly months. And Mr. Zook, I have to warn you, once word gets out about what you've discovered here, your quiet life is going to become much more complicated. There will be government agencies that need to be notified, energy companies that will want to lease your mineral rights, and probably media attention as well." That evening, as Amos and Sarah sat in their kitchen discussing the day's revelations, they both understood that they were standing at a crossroads. The discovery that had begun with a lightning strike was growing into something that could transform not just their lives, but their relationship with the community that had always been their anchor. "Are you having second thoughts?" Sarah asked quietly. Amos looked out the window toward the barn, where his great-grandfather's secrets had waited patiently for 8 decades to be revealed. "No," he said finally. Grostadi Ezra trusted that someday his descendants would be ready for this knowledge. Maybe that day has finally come. Word spread through the Amish community with the efficiency of a well-organized barn raising. Within days of Dr. Chen's visit, it seemed every family in their district had heard that Amos Zook was allowing English experts to examine his property. The stories grew with each telling. Some said government agents were involved. Others whispered about environmental contamination, and a few claimed he was secretly planning to sell the farm to developers. The truth, as it often did in small communities, became less important than the perception. And the perception was that Amos had crossed a line by inviting outsiders into their private affairs. Bishop Miller arrived at the farm on Thursday morning, his expression more troubled than angry. Amos met him at the gate, prepared for a difficult conversation. "Amos, my son," the bishop began, his voice carrying the weight of pastoral concern. "I've been hearing stories that worry me. People are saying you've brought in government people to examine your land." "Not government people, Bishop. An environmental consultant. I found some old storage containers that might be dangerous, and I wanted to make sure they weren't contaminating our water or soil." Bishop Miller stroked his long grey beard, considering this explanation. "I understand your concern for safety. But Amos, some families are worried that this is the beginning of something larger. They fear you're planning changes that could affect our whole community." It was a fair concern, and Amos couldn't honestly dismiss it. He had no idea where Dr. Chen's investigation might lead, or what kind of attention it might bring to their quiet corner of Lancaster County. "I'm not planning to change anything about how we live," Amos said carefully. "But Bishop, I discovered something important about my great-grandfather's history. Something that might help our family, and maybe our community too." "What kind of help are you talking about?" Amos hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. The geological survey reports suggested wealth beyond imagination, but discussing potential riches felt dangerous in a community that valued simplicity and feared the corrupting influence of sudden prosperity. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "That's why I need the experts to tell me what we're dealing with." The bishop was quiet for a long moment, studying Amos's face with the perceptive gaze of a man who had counseled his flock through decades of challenges and temptations. "Amos, I've known you since you were a boy. You've always been level-headed and faithful, but I'm going to ask you to be very careful about the path you're walking. Sometimes opportunities that seem like blessings can become curses if we're not prepared for them spiritually." After the bishop left, Amos found himself questioning everything he'd set in motion. Dr. Chen had promised to be discreet, but her team of specialists would attract attention that would be impossible to hide. And once the results of their investigation became known, there would be no returning to the simple anonymity he'd always taken for granted. That afternoon brought the first concrete evidence of how complicated his life was about to become. A black sedan pulled into his driveway, and 2 men in expensive suits approached his front porch. They introduced themselves as representatives from Chesapeake Energy, one of the largest natural gas companies in the region. Mr. Zook, the taller of the 2 men, said, "We understand you may have discovered some interesting geological features on your property. We'd like to discuss the possibility of leasing your mineral rights." Amos stared at them in shock. "How did you hear about that?" "Word travels fast in the energy business," the second man replied with a practiced smile, "especially when it involves potential resources in an underdeveloped area." The men were polite but persistent, explaining how mineral rights leases worked and the substantial payments that could be involved. They spoke of signing bonuses, royalty percentages, and long-term contracts that could provide generational wealth for his family. "Of course, we'd need to conduct our own geological surveys to confirm the extent of the deposits," the first man explained. But based on what we've heard, this could be a very lucrative arrangement for everyone involved. I haven't decided to lease anything to anyone, Amos said firmly. I don't even know yet what's actually down there. Mr. Zook, opportunities like this don't come along often. Other companies will be approaching you soon, and the competition can drive prices down. It might be wise to consider our offer before the market becomes saturated. After they left, Amos sat on his porch, feeling overwhelmed by the speed at which events were unfolding. In less than a week, his quiet discovery had attracted environmental consultants, energy company representatives, and community concern that threatened his standing in the only world he'd ever known. Sarah found him there an hour later, still staring at the business cards the men had left behind. "They want to lease our mineral rights," she asked after he explained the visit. "For a lot of money. More money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. And what did you tell them?" "That I need to understand what we're dealing with before I make any decisions." Sarah sat beside him on the porch steps, looking out over the fields where their ancestors had worked for over a century. "Amos, are you sure we want to know? Maybe Gross Daddy Ezra kept these secrets for good reasons." It was a question that had been haunting him since the lightning strike revealed the first hidden documents. Their great-grandfather had possessed knowledge that could have made the family wealthy, yet he had chosen to take that knowledge to his grave rather than burden his descendants with difficult choices. "I keep thinking about something Ezra wrote in one of his letters," Amos said slowly. "He said that if circumstances changed in the future, his descendants would have the information they need to make their own decisions. Maybe these are the circumstances he was talking about." "What circumstances?" "Look around, Sarah. The farm barely supports us anymore. Medical bills are getting more expensive, and we're not getting any younger. The roof on the house needs replacing. The well pump is failing, and we don't have the money for any of it. Maybe God used that lightning strike to show us a way forward." Before Sarah could respond, another car turned into their driveway, this one driven by Dr. Chen, who had promised to return with preliminary results from her initial assessment. She climbed out of her SUV carrying a thick folder of documents, her expression serious enough to suggest important news. "Mr. Zook, I have the results from our preliminary geological analysis," she said without preamble. "I think you should sit down for this conversation." As they gathered around the kitchen table, Dr. Chen spread out maps and charts. That meant little to Amos, but apparently told a compelling story to someone trained in reading such documents. "The geological survey your great-grandfather's government contacts conducted in 1943 was remarkably accurate," she began. "Your property sits on top of one of the largest untapped natural gas reserves in this region. Conservative estimates suggest the resource could be worth over $50 million. Optimistic projections put it closer to $111 million. The numbers were so large that they seemed abstract, meaningless. Amos had never owned anything worth more than a few $1,000s, and the concept of wealth measured in tens of millions was beyond his ability to comprehend. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "The stored materials in your underground chamber include several substances that are now considered quite valuable. Some of the rare metals alone could be worth several $1,000,000 to collectors and museums." As she spoke, Amos realized that his life had just changed irrevocably. The barn that his neighbors had mocked as worthless was sitting on top of a fortune that would make him one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania. The discovery that would eventually change everything came on a gray November morning while Amos was carefully cataloging the remaining documents from his great-grandfather's hidden cache. Tucked between official government contracts and geological surveys, he found a small bundle of personal letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, letters that revealed the human cost of Ezra's secret burden. The first letter was addressed to "My dear Anna," had written in Ezra's careful hand and dated March 1943. "My beloved wife, I write this knowing I may never be able to speak these words aloud. The work I have undertaken for our government weighs heavily on my conscience. To serve in this capacity, even as a civilian, feels like a betrayal of everything our people believe about peace and non-resistance. Yet I am told that the materials I am safeguarding may help end this terrible war more quickly, saving countless lives. I pray that God will forgive my compromise with worldly affairs, and that our children will never face such impossible choices. Amos read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling as he began to understand the moral anguish his great-grandfather had endured. Ezra hadn't been a willing collaborator with the government. He had been a man torn between his pacifist faith and his desire to contribute to ending a war that was consuming the world. The second letter, written 6 months later, revealed even deeper struggles. Anna, the burden of keeping secrets from our community grows heavier each day. Bishop Yoda asked yesterday why I spend so much time working alone in the barn, and I could not give him an honest answer. I'm becoming a stranger to my own people, isolated by knowledge I cannot share and choices I cannot explain. The money they pay me sits untouched in the hidden compartment. I cannot spend it when it feels like payment for betraying my principles. But it was the final letter, dated August 1945, that brought tears to Amos's eyes. My dearest Anna, the war is over, and the government men came today to discuss what should be done with the materials I have stored. They offered to purchase our land at 10 times its current value, saying the mineral deposits beneath it are worth a fortune that could secure our family's prosperity for generations. I have declined their offer. I have seen what sudden wealth does to people, how it changes them, divides them, makes them forget the simple truths that sustain the soul. Our children and grandchildren will face enough temptations in their lives without inheriting this one. If circumstances ever arise where they truly need this knowledge, they will find it. But for now, I choose to protect them from the burden of choosing between God and mammon. The secret dies with me, and perhaps that is as it should be. Amos sat in the barn's dusty silence, holding his great-grandfather's words and feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. Ezra had faced the exact same choice that now confronted his great-grandson, whether to accept wealth that could transform his family's circumstances or to preserve the simple life that had sustained them for generations. The difference was that Ezra had made his decision in private, consulting only his conscience and his God. Amos's choice would be made under the scrutiny of his community, energy companies, and increasingly, the media attention that Dr. Chen had warned him about. That afternoon brought proof of how public his situation had become. A reporter from the Lancaster New Era arrived at his farm, followed by a news van from a Philadelphia television station. Word of the discovery had somehow leaked beyond the local energy companies, and the story of an Amish farmer sitting on $100 million secret was apparently irresistible to journalists. Amos refused all interviews, but he could do nothing to stop the reporters from photographing his property and interviewing neighbors who were eager to share their opinions about his situation. Amos always was stubborn. Martha Stoltzfus told the newspaper reporter, her words carrying the sting of old resentments. When he spent all that money fixing up that worthless barn, we told him he was throwing good money after bad. Now he thinks he's sitting on a gold mine. We'll see how that works out for him. The television coverage was even more intrusive, with a reporter standing in front of his barn while explaining the story to viewers across the region. Behind me stands a barn that local residents have long considered an eyesore. But 67-year-old Amos Zook's refusal to tear it down may have been the wisest decision he ever made. Sources tell us that geological surveys have identified natural gas deposits worth over $100 million beneath this Lancaster County farm. That evening, Bishop Miller returned for another conversation, this one more serious than their previous discussion. Amos, he said, settling heavily into a kitchen chair, I've been getting calls from bishops in other districts. The story about your discovery is spreading, and people are asking questions about what this means for our community. What kind of questions? Whether sudden wealth will change you, whether you'll remain committed to our ways, or whether prosperity will lead you away from the faith that has sustained your family for generations. The bishop's concerns echoed Ezra's own fears, expressed in letters written 80 years earlier. "Bishop, I haven't decided to do anything yet. I'm still trying to understand what I'm dealing with. Amos, I want you to consider something carefully. Your great-grandfather was a wise man who understood the dangers of wealth. He chose to keep this knowledge secret to protect his family from temptation. Perhaps you should honor his decision by keeping the secret buried. It was the first time anyone had suggested that he should simply walk away from the discovery. The idea had a certain appeal. He could seal the underground chamber, destroy the documents, and return to the quiet anonymity he'd always known. But Sarah, who had been listening quietly from the stove where she was preparing dinner, spoke up for the first time. Bishop Miller, with respect, "Our circumstances aren't the same as Gross Daddy Ezra's were. He was a young man with his whole life ahead of him. Amos and I are getting older, and the farm is struggling. Medical bills are eating up what little savings we have, and we can't afford the repairs this old house needs. Maybe God revealed these secrets now because he knows we need them." The bishop looked surprised by Sarah's words. In their community, women rarely spoke so directly about family financial matters, especially to religious leadership. "Sarah, I understand your practical concerns," he said gently, "but there are some tests that are better avoided than faced. Wealth has destroyed more souls than poverty ever has." After the bishop left, Amos and Sarah sat in their kitchen, each lost in their own thoughts. The letters from their great-grandfather lay on the table between them, a bridge connecting their current dilemma to choices made in another century. "What do you think Gross Daddy would want us to do?" Sarah asked finally. Amos picked up the final letter, reading again Ezra's words about protecting his descendants from the burden of choosing between God and mammon. But he also remembered the postscript he'd initially overlooked. "If the time comes when this knowledge is needed, may God grant wisdom to those who must decide. I think," Amos said slowly, "he would want us to pray for wisdom and trust that God will guide our decision, just as he did when he faced this choice 80 years ago." Outside, the November wind rattled the windows of the old farmhouse, and in the barn across the yard, the secrets that had waited nearly a century for discovery continued their patient vigil, ready to transform lives or destroy them, depending on the wisdom of the choices yet to be made. The phone call that changed everything came on a cold December morning while Amos was feeding the horses. Sarah's voice carried across the barnyard with an urgency that made him drop the hay bale and run toward the house. "Amos," she called from the porch, "Dr. Chen is on the phone. She says it's urgent." Inside, Dr. Chen's voice carried a tension he hadn't heard before. "Mr. Zook, we need to talk immediately. I've discovered something in the legal research that changes everything about your situation." "What kind of something?" "I can't discuss this over the phone. I'm driving out there now." "Don't talk to anyone else until I arrive. Not energy company representatives, not reporters, not anyone." An hour later, Dr. Chen sat at their kitchen table with a stack of legal documents that she spread out with the solemnity of someone delivering devastating news. "Mr. Zook, I have to tell you something that's going to be difficult to hear. The natural gas deposits beneath your property, you don't own them." The words hit Amos like a physical blow. "What do you mean I don't own them?" "The mineral rights to your property were separated from the surface rights in 1934 during the Great Depression. Your great-grandfather sold them to pay off debts and keep the farm." Dr. Chen pulled out a faded legal document, the original land deed with mineral rights clause that would become the story's pivotal artifact. The yellowed paper bore official seals and signatures that looked authentic, but the implications were devastating. According to this deed, filed with the Lancaster County Clerk of Courts in March 1934, Ezra Zook sold the mineral rights beneath his property to something called the Pennsylvania Resource Development Corporation for the sum of $12,500. Sarah leaned forward to examine the document. "But that doesn't make sense. If Gross Daddy sold the mineral rights, why was he storing materials for the government?" Why did they do geological surveys of his land? That's what makes this so complicated, Dr. Chen replied. The government was apparently unaware that the mineral rights had already been sold. They conducted their surveys and stored their materials, assuming that your great-grandfather owned everything beneath his property. Amos studied the deed, trying to understand how this changed their situation. So the $100 million worth of natural gas that belongs to this Pennsylvania Resource Development Corporation, that's where it gets even more complicated. I've spent the past week researching this company, and it appears to have been dissolved. Sometime in the 1950s, there's no clear chain of ownership from that point forward. Dr. Chen pulled out additional documents that showed her investigation into the corporate history. The original corporation was owned by a group of Philadelphia businessmen who were buying up mineral rights throughout Pennsylvania during the Depression, when desperate farmers were willing to sell them cheaply. But the company went out of business without properly transferring those rights to new owners. What does that mean for us? It means the mineral rights are in legal limbo. They don't clearly belong to you, but they don't clearly belong to anyone else either. Any attempt to develop those resources would require a court decision about rightful ownership. The implications were staggering. The fortune that had seemed within reach was suddenly clouded by legal uncertainties that could take years to resolve. Worse, the energy companies that had been eager to lease his mineral rights would now back away from any deals until the ownership question was settled. There's more bad news, Dr. Chen continued. I had to report my findings to the State Environmental Agency, since the stored materials in your barn are technically abandoned hazardous waste. They're sending inspectors next week to assess the situation. Amos felt the walls of his quiet life closing in around him. What will the inspectors do? They'll catalog everything, test for contamination, and determine whether the materials need to be removed. The process could take months, and during that time, your barn will be considered a restricted site. Sarah spoke for the first time since Dr. Chen had begun her explanation. So we can't use the barn, we can't develop the mineral rights, and we're going to have government inspectors treating our property like a toxic waste site. I'm afraid that's accurate. And there's one more thing you should know. The energy companies that were interested in leasing your mineral rights have been informed about the ownership dispute. They've all withdrawn their offers pending legal clarification. That afternoon, Amos walked through his property with new eyes. The fields that had supported his family for generations were still his, but the valuable resources beneath them belonged to no one and everyone. The barn that had revealed its secrets now stood as a monument to legal complexity rather than hidden treasure. The irony wasn't lost on him. His great-grandfather had refused to develop the mineral resources to protect his family from the corrupting influence of wealth. Now, through a twist of legal fate, that wealth was beyond reach anyway. When Daniel Byler stopped by that evening, Amos shared the disappointing news with his oldest friend. "So the gas is there, but you can't touch it?" Daniel asked, trying to understand the legal complexities. "That's right. And the energy companies aren't interested in dealing with a property where ownership is disputed." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then surprised Amos with his response. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." "How can you say that? We're talking about millions of dollars." "Amos, I've watched what oil and gas development does to farming communities. It brings money, yes, but it also brings noise, traffic, industrial equipment, and people who don't understand our ways. Maybe God is protecting you from something you think you want, but don't really need." That evening, as news of the ownership dispute spread through the community, Amos noticed a change in his neighbors' attitudes. The envy and resentment that had begun to build when people thought he was about to become wealthy was replaced by something that might have been relief, or even sympathy. Martha Stoltzfus, who had been among his harshest critics, stopped by the farm with a casserole and an unexpected apology. "Amos, I heard about your legal troubles," she said, setting the covered dish on his kitchen table. "I want you to know that some of us have been praying for you. We may have thought you were foolish for spending money on that old barn, but you didn't deserve to have your hopes raised and then dashed like this." Bishop Miller's reaction was more complex. When he arrived the next morning, his expression mixed concern with something that might have been relief. "Amos, I've been praying about your situation," he said. "I won't lie to you. Part of me is grateful that the temptation of great wealth has been removed, but I'm sorry that you and Sarah have been put through this ordeal. Bishop, I keep wondering if this is God's way of telling me I should have left well enough alone. Maybe I should have just torn down the barn years ago and avoided all this trouble, perhaps. Or perhaps God allowed you to discover these secrets so that you could learn something about your great-grandfather's character that your family needed to know. Sometimes the journey is more important than the destination." As December progressed, Amos found himself in a strange position. The media attention that had focused on his potential wealth gradually faded as the legal complications made his story less compelling. The energy company representatives stopped calling. Even Dr. Chen's visits became less frequent as her investigation reached the limits of what environmental science could accomplish. But in the quiet that followed the chaos, Amos began to appreciate something he hadn't expected. The barn that had caused him so much trouble was still standing, still sheltering his great-grandfather's secrets, still connecting him to a family history that was far more complex and interesting than he had ever imagined. The mineral rights might be beyond his reach, but the knowledge of his great-grandfather's wartime service, his moral struggles, and his ultimate wisdom in protecting his family from the burden of wealth, that knowledge belonged to Amos and Sarah alone. As he sat in the barn on Christmas Eve, reading Ezra's letters by lamplight, Amos realized that perhaps his great-grandfather's greatest gift wasn't the hidden treasure he'd protected, but the example he'd set of making difficult choices with integrity and wisdom. The $100 million might never be his, but the legacy of character that Ezra had left behind was worth something that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. The new year brought an unexpected visitor to the Zook farm, one whose arrival would set in motion the final act of Amos's journey. Martha Holloway stepped out of a modest Honda Civic on a crisp January morning, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested she was accustomed to fighting uphill battles. "Mr. Zook," she said, extending a firm handshake, "I'm Martha Holloway from the Pennsylvania Historic Preservation Society. I believe you may have discovered something that could be of tremendous historical significance." Unlike the energy company representatives who had descended on his farm months earlier, Martha Holloway radiated a different kind of purpose. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a professional style and eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed his property. "Dr. Chen contacted our organization about the wartime storage facility you discovered," she continued. "What you found here represents one of the most complete examples of a classified World War II emergency storage site that's ever been documented." Amos invited her inside, where Sarah served coffee while Martha spread out documents. That would become the legal brief for historic preservation, the artifact that would offer an unexpected solution to their seemingly impossible situation. "Mr. Zook, I need to ask you some difficult questions," Martha began. "Are you prepared to fight for your right to this discovery?" "I'm not sure what you mean." "The materials stored in your barn, the documents your great-grandfather preserved, the barn itself, these aren't just personal family artifacts. They're pieces of American history that deserve protection. But protecting them is going to require challenging some very powerful interests." Martha explained that her research had uncovered something Dr. Chen had missed. The Pennsylvania Resource Development Corporation that had purchased the mineral rights in 1934 had been a shell company created by wealthy investors who were systematically taking advantage of Depression-era farmers. These companies bought mineral rights for pennies on the dollar from desperate families who had no idea what their land might be worth, she said. pulling out historical records that documented similar transactions across Pennsylvania. In many cases, the sales were conducted under questionable circumstances. Farmers were told they were signing temporary agreements or leases, not permanent transfers of ownership. She showed them a photograph of the original contract signing, found in the Lancaster County Historical Archives. In the grainy black and white image, Ezra Zook looked haggard and defeated as he signed papers across from two well-dressed men in expensive suits. Your great-grandfather was forced into this sale by circumstances beyond his control, Martha continued. The question is whether that sale should be considered legally valid today, especially given what we now know about the predatory practices of these companies. Amos studied the photograph, seeing his great-grandfather in a new light. Rather than a man who had casually sold away his family's future, Ezra appeared to be someone trapped by economic forces and making the best of an impossible situation. What are you suggesting we do? I'm suggesting we challenge the validity of that 1934 sale in court. There are legal precedents for cases where Depression-era mineral rights sales were conducted under duress or through misrepresentation. If we can prove your great-grandfather was coerced or deceived, the courts might restore those rights to your family. Sarah leaned forward, her expression skeptical. But wouldn't that take years and cost more money than we could ever afford? Martha smiled for the first time since arriving. That's where the historical preservation angle becomes important. The barn itself, with its hidden chambers and stored materials, represents a unique piece of World War II history. If we can get it designated as a historic landmark, that designation would protect not just the building, but the family's right to the property as its traditional stewards. She pulled out a thick legal brief that represented weeks of research and preparation. I've been working with a team of lawyers who specialize in heritage rights cases. They believe your situation presents an opportunity to establish important precedents about family property rights and historical preservation. The legal strategy Martha outlined was complex but compelling. Rather than simply challenging the mineral rights sale, they would argue that the barn and its contents represented a cultural and historical treasure that belonged to the family who had preserved it for 8 decades. The key, she explained, is that your great-grandfather didn't just store materials for the government. He became the custodian of an important piece of American history. His decision to preserve everything, including the documents that proved the mineral deposits existed, shows that he understood the historical significance of what he was protecting. Amos was intrigued but cautious. What would happen if we win? If we win, you would regain legal ownership of the mineral rights. More importantly, the barn would be protected as a historic site, ensuring that your great-grandfather's story becomes part of the official historical record. And if we lose? Martha's expression grew serious. If we lose, you would likely face pressure to allow the stored materials to be removed by environmental cleanup crews. The barn might be condemned as unsafe, and the mineral rights would remain in legal limbo indefinitely. That evening, Amos and Sarah discussed Martha's proposal long into the night. The legal battle she was suggesting would thrust them into the public eye in ways that went against everything their quiet faith had taught them about avoiding worldly conflicts. But maybe, Sarah said thoughtfully, this isn't about worldly conflicts. Maybe this is about honoring Grossdaddy Ezra's memory and protecting what he worked so hard to preserve. The next morning brought validation for Martha's approach in an unexpected form. Bishop Miller arrived with several other community elders, including Daniel Byler and 2 of the district's most respected farmers. Amos, the bishop said, settling into his usual kitchen chair, we've been discussing your situation as a community. We want you to know that if you decide to fight for your family's rights, you won't be fighting alone. The show of support was unprecedented in Amos's experience. The Amish typically avoided legal battles, preferring to resolve conflicts through community mediation or simply accepting losses rather than engaging with the English court system. We've come to understand, Daniel added, that this isn't just about money or mineral rights. This is about respecting the sacrifices your great-grandfather made for his country and his family. That's worth defending. The bishop nodded gravely. We've also learned more about these companies that were buying mineral rights during the Depression. They took advantage of many families in our community, not just yours. Perhaps it's time someone stood up to them. With his community's support secured, Amos made the decision to move forward with Martha's legal strategy. The first step was to apply for historic landmark designation for the barn, a process that would require extensive documentation and testimony about its historical significance. Dr. Chen returned to help prepare the historical assessment, bringing with her a team of experts who catalogued every aspect of the barn's construction and contents. Historians, archaeologists, and preservation specialists worked for weeks to build a comprehensive case for the barn's importance. The process attracted new media attention, but this time the coverage was different. Instead of focusing on Amos as a potentially wealthy farmer, reporters began telling the story of Amos Zook's wartime service and the unique historical site he had created. This barn represents one of the most complete examples of civilian participation in World War II's classified storage program. A historian from Temple University told a Philadelphia television reporter, "The fact that everything was preserved intact for 80 years makes it invaluable for understanding how ordinary Americans contributed to the war effort." As the historic designation process moved forward, opposition emerged from an unexpected source. Lawyers representing modern successors to the old Pennsylvania Resource Development Corporation filed objections, claiming that historic designation would interfere with their clients' legitimate property rights. The legal battle that Martha had predicted was about to begin, and Amos found himself at the center of a conflict that would determine not just his family's financial future, but the fate of his great-grandfather's carefully preserved legacy. On the evening before the first court hearing, Amos sat in the barn where everything had started, surrounded by the documents and artifacts that told the story of his family's hidden history. The building that had once been mocked as worthless was now recognized by experts as a treasure worth fighting for. But the real treasure, he had come to understand, wasn't the natural gas deposits or the stored materials or even the potential for wealth. It was the example his great-grandfather had set of making difficult choices with wisdom and integrity, and the community that had rallied around him when he needed support. Tomorrow, he would walk into a courtroom and fight for his family's rights. Win or lose, he would do so with the knowledge that he was honoring the legacy of a man who had faced his own impossible choices with courage and grace. The lightning that had split open that support beam had revealed more than hidden documents. It had revealed the strength that had always existed within his family and his community, waiting for the right moment to be called upon. The Lancaster County courthouse had never seen anything quite like the scene that unfolded on the morning of February 15th. The ornate 19th century building, with its towering columns and marble steps, found itself hosting a David and Goliath confrontation that had captured the attention of media outlets, from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Amos Zook climbed those steps in his best Sunday clothes, flanked by Sarah and Martha Holloway, while behind them walked a contingent of Amish community members whose presence spoke louder than any words they might have offered. Bishop Miller, Daniel Byler, and nearly 30 other farmers and their families had made the journey to the county seat, their plain dress and solemn dignity creating a striking contrast to the suited lawyers and television cameras that crowded the courthouse entrance. Inside Courtroom 3, Judge Patricia Williamson, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, called the case to order with the ceremonial gavel that would serve as this chapter's defining artifact. The simple wooden mallet represented the power of the legal system to either validate Amos's claim or dismiss it, determining not just his financial future, but the fate of his great-grandfather's legacy. "The case before us today," Judge Williamson announced, concerns the property rights of Amos Zook regarding mineral deposits and historical artifacts discovered on his Lancaster County farm. This court will determine the validity of a 1934 mineral rights transfer and the family's claim to materials stored on their property during World War II. The opposing side was formidable. A.E. team of corporate lawyers representing the legal successors to the Pennsylvania Resource Development Corporation, backed by energy companies whose potential profits depended on maintaining the status quo. Their lead attorney, a polished man in an expensive suit, approached the bench with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is quite straightforward. The mineral rights in question were legally purchased from Ezra Zook in 1934, with all proper documentation filed with the county. The plaintiff's attempt to overturn a transaction that occurred nearly 90 years ago sets a dangerous precedent that could undermine property rights throughout Pennsylvania." His presentation was smooth and methodical, citing legal precedents and contractual obligations with the practiced ease of someone who had argued similar cases dozens of times. The mineral rights had been sold in a legitimate transaction, he argued, and no amount of emotional appeal about family history could change that basic legal reality. But when Martha Holloway rose to present Amos's case, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed perceptibly. She approached the bench, carrying the original documents Amos had discovered, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent years fighting for underdogs. "Your Honor, this case is about more than property rights. It's about justice, historical preservation, and the protection of families from predatory business practices that took advantage of Depression-era desperation." She began by presenting evidence of the Pennsylvania Resource Development Corporation's systematic exploitation of struggling farmers, showing how the company had specifically targeted Amish communities where language barriers and cultural isolation made families vulnerable to deception. The defendant corporation's own records, which we have obtained through discovery, show that they deliberately sought out families who were unlikely to understand the full implications of the contracts they were signing. In Ezra Zook's case, the company representatives told him he was signing a temporary lease agreement, not a permanent transfer of mineral rights. The evidence Martha presented was damning. Internal company memos that discussed targeting simple farming families and strategies for obtaining mineral rights at below-market prices. One memo specifically mentioned the Zook property, noting that the farmer appears to have limited English and is unlikely to seek independent legal counsel. But the most powerful moment came when Martha called Amos to testify on his own behalf. As he walked to the witness stand, the packed courtroom fell silent. Every eye focused on the elderly Amish farmer who had never asked for the spotlight now shining on him. "Mr. Zook," Martha began gently, "can you tell the court what your great-grandfather's barn has meant to your family?" Amos spoke slowly, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "My great-grandfather built that barn with his own hands, and he filled it with secrets that he carried alone for his entire life. He could have become rich from what he knew, but he chose instead to protect his family from temptation. When lightning struck that barn and revealed what he had hidden, I felt the responsibility of his choice passing to me." As he described finding the documents and learning about Ezra's wartime service, several jurors leaned forward, clearly moved by the human dimension of what had seemed like a simple property dispute. The corporate attorney's cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. When he tried to portray Amos as a greedy farmer seeking to overturn legitimate contracts, the quiet dignity of the man in the witness stand made such characterizations ring false. "Mr. Zook, isn't it true that you stand to gain millions of dollars if this court rules in your favor?" "If God wills it," Amos replied simply. "But money isn't why I'm here. I'm here because my great-grandfather trusted his descendants to do right by his memory. I won't let him down." The second day of the hearing began with testimony that would prove decisive. Martha Holloway had saved her most powerful evidence for last, the original barn beam that had been split by lightning, now carefully transported to the courthouse as physical proof of the family's connection to their history. The massive oak timber, 8 feet long and scarred by both time and electricity, sat in the well of the courtroom like an ancient witness ready to tell its story. This beam, the original barn beam that had started everything, served as the climactic artifact, representing not just the physical structure Ezra had built, but the enduring strength of family bonds that had survived 8 decades of secrecy, Your Honor, Martha said, approaching the witness stand where Dr. Rebecca Chen had been sworn in as an expert witness. I'd like Dr. Chen to explain the historical significance of what Mr. Zook preserved in his barn. Dr. Chen's testimony was methodical and compelling. She described the rarity of finding intact World War II storage sites, the scientific value of the preserved materials, and the meticulous care with which Ezra had documented everything for posterity. In my 20 years of environmental consulting, she told the court, I have never encountered a site where classified wartime materials were preserved with such attention to historical detail. Mr. Zook's great-grandfather wasn't just storing materials, he was creating a time capsule that would allow future generations to understand this forgotten chapter of American history. But it was Sarah's testimony that brought tears to several jurors' eyes. Amos's sister took the stand with quiet dignity, her plain dress and prayer covering marking her as someone who rarely ventured into the English world of courts and legal proceedings. My brother has been mocked by our community for years because he wouldn't tear down that old barn, she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. People called him foolish, said he was wasting money on something worthless. But Amos knew something the rest of us didn't. He knew that our great-grandfather had built more than just a barn. He had built a trust that was passed down to us. Sarah's words seemed to resonate with Judge Williamson, who had listened to 2 days of technical legal arguments with professional detachment but now appeared genuinely moved by the human story unfolding before her. The corporate lawyers made their final argument with polished efficiency, insisting that emotional appeals couldn't override legal precedent and contractual obligations. But when Martha rose for her closing statement, she focused not on legal technicalities, but on the broader question of justice. Your Honor, this case asks us to decide what we value more: the letter of a contract signed under questionable circumstances 90 years ago, or the spirit of justice that protects families from exploitation. Ezra Zook was a man who served his country in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. He stored classified materials. He provided valuable intelligence about his property's geological features, and he kept secrets that weighed on his conscience for the rest of his life. She gestured toward the lightning-split beam that dominated the courtroom. That piece of wood represents more than just construction material. It represents the foundation of a family's integrity, built by a man who chose protecting his descendants over personal profit. The lightning that split it open didn't just reveal hidden documents, it revealed a legacy of character that this court has the power to either honor or dismiss. As Martha spoke, the packed courtroom remained absolutely silent. The Amish community members who had traveled from Lancaster County sat with the patient stillness of people accustomed to long worship services, while reporters and legal observers found themselves drawn into a story that transcended property rights and mineral resources. The defendants would have you believe this is simply a matter of honoring old contracts, Martha continued. But those contracts were signed by a man who was told he was agreeing to a temporary lease, not a permanent transfer. They were signed by a man who spoke limited English and had no access to legal counsel. They were signed by a man who was facing financial ruin and had little choice but to accept whatever terms were offered. She paused, allowing her words to settle before delivering her final appeal. Your Honor, Ezra Zook spent his life protecting his family from the burden of sudden wealth. But he also preserved evidence of his sacrifice, trusting that someday his descendants would have the wisdom to make their own choices. Today, this court has the opportunity to validate that trust and ensure that a family's legacy of integrity is not destroyed by the predatory practices of Depression-era profiteers. Judge Williamson called for a recess to consider her decision, and the courtroom emptied slowly as people stepped outside to wait in the February cold. Amos stood on the courthouse steps surrounded by his community, feeling both exhausted and oddly peaceful. Whatever happened next, he had honored his great-grandfather's memory by fighting for the truth. Inside the courthouse, the lightning-split beam waited in silent testimony to the strength that could be found in things that appeared broken, and to the wisdom of building foundations that would endure long after their creators had passed into memory. The decision that would determine his family's future was now in the hands of the judge, and ultimately in the hands of the God who had guided his great-grandfather through his own impossible choices 8 decades earlier. 6 months later, on a warm August morning that mirrored the peaceful beginning of this story, Amos Zook stood in front of his barn, now officially designated as the Ezra Zook World War II Heritage Site, watching as workers installed a bronze plaque that would tell his great-grandfather's story to future generations. The plaque, simple and dignified in design, served as the final artifact in their journey, a marker that honored both Ezra's service and Amos's preservation of family legacy. It read, "This site commemorates Ezra Zook, 1895-1975, who served his country during World War II by providing secure storage for classified materials while maintaining the values of his Amish faith. His commitment to both duty and family created a legacy preserved by his descendants for the education of future generations." Judge Williamson's decision had been decisive and comprehensive. She had ruled that the 1934 mineral rights sale was invalid due to misrepresentation and coercion, restoring full ownership of the property's resources to the Zook family. More importantly for Amos, she had endorsed the barn's designation as a historic landmark, ensuring its preservation in perpetuity. The evidence clearly shows, she had written in her decision, that the defendant's predecessor company engaged in predatory practices specifically designed to exploit vulnerable farming families. Furthermore, the historical significance of the materials preserved on this site creates a compelling public interest in protecting both the property and the family's stewardship of it. The victory had brought changes to Amos's life, but not the kind of changes his great-grandfather had feared. Instead of sudden wealth corrupting his values, the legal settlement had provided financial security that allowed him to strengthen his commitment to the simple life that had always sustained him. He had used part of the mineral rights leasing income to establish a fund for Amish families facing medical emergencies, something that would have made Ezra proud. The barn itself had been restored to its original condition while maintaining its historical integrity, and guided tours now brought visitors from across the country to learn about civilian contributions to the war effort. Sarah emerged from the farmhouse carrying 2 cups of coffee, her face showing the contentment that had replaced the worry lines of the past year. "The reporter from the Washington Post will be here in an hour," she reminded him. "Are you ready for another interview?" Amos smiled, still somewhat amazed by the national attention their story had attracted. The case had established important legal precedents for historic preservation and family property rights, making it a subject of interest for legal scholars and historians alike. "I think so. Though I still can't believe people want to hear what an old Amish farmer has to say about legal battles and family history." "You're not just an old farmer anymore," Sarah said with gentle teasing. "You're the man who proved that preserving the past is sometimes the best way to secure the future." As they sat on the porch steps sharing their morning coffee, Daniel Beeler's buggy turned into the driveway. Their old friend climbed down with a newspaper in his hand and a grin on his weathered face. Amos, have you seen this? He held up the Lancaster New Era, whose front page featured a story about the barn's one-year anniversary as a historic site. They're calling you the guardian of hidden history. The article described how the site had become a model for other historic preservation efforts, and how the Zook family's commitment to maintaining their traditional lifestyle while sharing their story had inspired similar projects across Pennsylvania. Listen to this, Daniel continued, reading from the article. The Zook family's decision to preserve their great-grandfather's legacy while remaining true to their Amish values demonstrates that progress and tradition need not be mutually exclusive. Their story offers hope to other families facing the choice between economic opportunity and cultural preservation. Bishop Miller arrived shortly after Daniel, bringing news that would have pleased Ezra most of all. Amos, I wanted you to know. The ministers from 6 districts met yesterday to discuss your situation. We've decided to officially recognize the barn as a community asset. Any income it generates for educational purposes will be considered a form of mutual aid, fully consistent with our faith. The bishop's words represented the final resolution of the conflict that had troubled Amos most. His community had not only accepted his choices, but had embraced them as an example of how modern challenges could be met without abandoning ancient values. As the morning visitors departed and the reporter arrived for her interview, Amos reflected on the journey that had begun with lightning striking his barn and ended with that same barn becoming a symbol of family strength and historical preservation. The reporter, a young woman from Washington who had covered their court case, was particularly interested in how the experience had changed his perspective on life. Mr. Zook, when you first discovered those hidden documents, did you ever imagine it would lead to all this? Amos looked out over the fields where his great-great-grandfather had first planted crops over a century ago, then at the barn where his great-grandfather had stored secrets for 8 decades. No, I never imagined any of this. But I've learned that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't the ones we're looking for. I thought I was just trying to preserve an old building, but what I really found was a deeper understanding of my family's character and my community's strength. What would you tell other people who are facing difficult choices between financial opportunity and family values? Amos was quiet for a moment, thinking of his great-grandfather's letters and the burden of choices that had weighed on Ezra's conscience for so many years. I'd tell them what my great-grandfather's example taught me, that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold. Family, community, integrity, faith. These are treasures that get stronger when they're shared, not weaker. Money can disappear, but character lasts forever. As the sun climbed higher over Lancaster County, casting long shadows across the fields, where 4 generations of Zooks had worked and worried and found their way forward through changing times, Amos felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've honored those who came before while preparing a foundation for those who will come. After the barn, that had once been mocked as worthless, now stood as a testament to the wisdom of preserving what matters most, and the lightning that had revealed its secrets had ultimately illuminated truths about strength, family, and the patient power of doing what's right, even when the whole world thinks you're wrong.